The flight to Crete. On my mark, the sergeant whispered, his voice tense. The paratrooper nodded, his heart in his throat. The sergeant counted down, and when he reached 1, they all jumped up and sprinted towards the house. One by one, the men ahead of him leaped into the void, disappearing into the swirling chaos outside. When it was his turn, he took a deep breath, steeling himself. He glanced back one last time, catching the eyes of a young private who looked as terrified as he felt. Then, with a push, he was out. He could barely hear his own thoughts over the roar of the engines, but his mind was racing. Just days before, they had been briefed on Operation Mercury. A daring airborne assault on the island of Crete. Intelligence had warned of strong Allied defenses, but the Führer himself had believed the surprise and shock of their descent would overwhelm the enemy. The paratrooper wasn't so sure. As he drifted closer, he could see tiny figures moving on the ground, flashes of muzzle fire, and the dark shapes of wrecked gliders and burning planes. Paratroopers were scattered everywhere, some descending into trees, others landing directly into the middle of enemy positions. He realized with a cold shock that they were under heavy fire. The paratrooper nodded, his mind racing. He had trained for this, but training was different from the real thing. He looked around, spotting a path that led up the hill, covered by shrubs and low walls. He signaled to the others, and together they began to move, crouching low and keeping to the shadows. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of him. He struggled to his feet, his hands fumbling with the release cords on his parachute. Bullets whipped through the air around him, and he heard the sharp crack of rifles and the thump of grenades. He grabbed his rifle and scrambled for cover behind a rocky outcrop, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it might burst from his chest. Around him, the scene was chaos. He could see other paratroopers trying to regroup, some firing wildly at unseen enemies, others dragging wounded comrades to safety. He spotted a group of men pinned down near a stone wall, under heavy fire from a machine gun nest. Without thinking, he dashed towards them, his boots slipping on the loose rocks and dry earth. The world seemed to slow down as he pulled the pin and hurled the grenade. It sailed through the air, disappearing into the open window of the house. He dove to the ground, covering his head as the explosion rocked the hillside. When he looked up, the machine gun fire had stopped. The sound of gunfire and explosions filled the air as they advanced, pausing every few meters to catch their breath. When they reached the base of the hill, he could see the muzzle flashes of the machine gun, the bullets kicking up dust and dirt around them. He took a deep breath, his hands shaking as he unhooked a grenade from his belt. They stormed the house, rifles ready. Inside, it was a scene of destruction. The crew manning the machine gun lay dead or wounded, the walls splattered with blood and dust. The paratrooper felt a strange mix of relief and horror as he looked around. This was just the beginning. The plane shuddered as it hit turbulence, and he gripped his rifle tighter. They had taken off from airfields in Greece before dawn. A massive airborne armada of planes and gliders filled with thousands of German paratroopers and mountain troops. The plan was to secure key airfields on the island, allowing reinforcements to land and overwhelm the Allied forces holding Crete. But as they neared the island, he could sense the tension rising among the men. He stepped outside, squinting in the harsh sunlight. The airfield was still in the distance, but they had made some progress. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. There was no turning back now. He was in the thick of it, and the battle for Crete had only just begun. The inside of the Ju-52 transport plane was dark, cramped, and filled with the steady drone of engines that seemed to vibrate through every bone in the paratrooper's body. The smell of sweat, oil, and fear was thick in the air. He adjusted his harness, feeling the weight of the parachute tugging at his shoulders, and glanced around at his comrades. Their faces, illuminated only by the dim red glow of the overhead light, were set with a mixture of determination and unease. For many of them, including himself, this was their first time jumping into combat. The green light flickered on near the door, and his heart began to race. This was it. The men in the plane shifted nervously, checking their gear one last time. The jumpmaster shouted a final command, and the door was wrenched open, flooding the interior with a blast of cold air and the deafening roar of the wind. The paratrooper felt his pulse quicken as he moved into position, his hands trembling slightly as he grasped the static line. He looked out through the small window. The sea below was a vast, dark expanse, reflecting the first hints of dawn on the horizon. As the light grew, he could make out the faint silhouette of Crete in the distance. It looked peaceful, almost serene. But he knew better. He had heard the stories of fierce resistance from British, New Zealand, Australian, and Greek forces. He had also heard of the Cretan partisans, civilians armed with nothing but ancient rifles and kitchen knives, ready to fight for every inch of their island. The world seemed to explode around him as he tumbled into the open sky. The wind tore at his uniform, and he felt the sickening lurch of freefall before his parachute snapped open with a jolt. He was suddenly suspended in the air, swaying gently as he tried to get his bearings. Below him, the island of Crete spread out like a map. He could see the airfield at Maleme, their primary target, but it was surrounded by bursts of anti-aircraft fire and smoke. It looked like hell on earth. He slid into cover beside them, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The man next to him, a sergeant, glanced at him, shouted over the noise, "We need to take out that position, or we're all dead." He pointed towards a stone house on a hill, where the machine gun fire was coming from. "Now go, go, go." "Can you see anything?" he asked, his voice hoarse from shouting over the noise of battle. "Wait for the barrage," the sergeant said, glancing at his watch. "It should be any second now." "Ready?" the sergeant asked, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "This isn't over yet," the sergeant said, his voice rough. "We still have a long way to go." "What are we going to do?" one of the men asked, his voice shaking. He turned, his eyes wide with fear and adrenaline. More Germans were pouring into the trench, struggling with the British defenders in brutal hand-to-hand combat. He saw the sergeant grappling with an enemy soldier, the two of them locked in a deadly struggle. The paratrooper raised his rifle, but he couldn't get a clear shot. He hesitated, his hands trembling. "We can't stay here much longer," the sergeant muttered, his eyes scanning the battlefield. "If we don't take that airfield by nightfall, we're finished." Then, with a final shove, the sergeant overpowered the Brit, slamming him against the wall of the trench. He looked up, his face smeared with blood and dirt, and gave the paratrooper a nod. "Move up. We need to take out that mortar." He glanced to his left, where the sergeant was peering through binoculars, his face grim. They had regrouped with remnants of several other units, all battered and weary. The plan had been to secure the airfield quickly, but they had landed in the worst possible spot too far west, right into the path of enemy defenses. Many of their comrades had been cut down before even hitting the ground. The thought of the bodies he had seen dangling from trees and sprawled across the rocky fields made his stomach churn. The sergeant lowered the binoculars and shook his head. "The Tommies have set up machine guns all along the perimeter. There's a mortar position by that hangar too. We'll be torn to shreds if we move out in the open." He nodded, gripping his rifle tighter. Around him the other men were preparing themselves, checking their weapons and sharing quick, nervous glances. He felt a strange sense of solidarity with them, these men he had barely known before today. They were all in this together, for better or worse. He felt a surge of anger at the thought. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. They were the elite, the Fallschirmjäger, trained for the toughest missions, but nothing had prepared them for this kind of hell. He glanced at the men around him, their faces drawn and pale, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. They had all been through so much already. Some of them had barely made it out of the gliders and transport planes alive. He remembered the chaotic scramble to cut himself free from his parachute straps while under fire, the frantic dash to find cover as mortars rained down. The paratrooper nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He knew the sergeant was right. They had tried to push forward twice already, only to be driven back by a hail of bullets and shrapnel. Now they were pinned down, their ammunition running low, and their spirits lower still. They nodded, muttering words of encouragement to each other. The paratrooper's heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves, but it did little good. Then, the ground shook as the first shells hit, exploding in bursts of flame and smoke. The paratrooper flinched at the deafening roar, the shockwaves reverberating through his bones. Dirt and debris rained down around them, and he could hear the cries of men caught in the blast. The sergeant raised his arm, signaling them to move. He scrambled up, his ears ringing, his vision blurred. He could see the trench line just ahead, men spilling over the edge, firing wildly as they charged. He pushed himself forward, his heart racing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't think, didn't feel, he just ran. He reached the trench, dropping into the narrow, muddy ditch. It was chaos. Bodies lay sprawled in the muck, some dead, others writhing in agony. The paratrooper barely had time to register the scene before a British soldier appeared at the edge, raising his rifle. The paratrooper fired instinctively, the shot echoing in his ears as the man crumpled, falling into the trench beside him. With a shout, he pulled the pin and hurled it towards the mortar. It landed just short, exploding in a shower of dirt and shrapnel. The crew scattered, one of them clutching his leg as he fell. The paratrooper fired his rifle, the shots muffled by the roar of the battle. He saw one of the crew go down, the others diving for cover. The paratrooper nodded, his mouth dry. He scrambled over the bodies, his boots slipping in the mud and blood. He could see the mortar position ahead, the crew frantically reloading as German grenades exploded around them. He took a deep breath, his fingers numb, as he grabbed a grenade from his belt. They had done it. The airfield was still in enemy hands, but they had broken through. The paratrooper felt a surge of relief, mixed with a sickening sense of horror at the carnage around him. He glanced at the sergeant, who was wiping his blade on his uniform, his face set in a grim mask. The paratrooper nodded, his mouth dry. He knew the sergeant was right. They had taken the trench, the struggle for Maleme Airfield. He advanced, his heart in his throat. The rest of the men were with him, pushing forward, their faces grim and determined. The paratrooper fired again, his shoulder aching from the recoil. He saw the sergeant leap over the trench, charging towards the mortar. The paratrooper followed, his legs trembling with exhaustion and fear. The harsh Cretan sun blazed overhead as the paratrooper crouched behind a crumbling stone wall, his mouth dry and his eyes stinging from sweat and dust. It was late morning, but it felt like they had been fighting for days. The air was thick with the acrid stench of gunpowder and smoke. Explosions echoed in the distance, mingling with the desperate shouts of men and the relentless rattle of machine gun fire. Every muscle in his body ached, and his hands were raw from scrambling over rocks and gripping his rifle. A sudden burst of gunfire snapped him back to attention. He ducked instinctively as bullets whizzed overhead, chipping away at the stones of the wall. To his right, a young private screamed and clutched his arm, blood streaming between his fingers. Another man dragged him back behind cover, pressing a bandage to the wound. Ahead of him lay Maleme Airfield, their primary objective. What should have been a swift capture had turned into a bloody stalemate. From his position, he could see the control tower looming above the runway, the once pristine structure now pockmarked with bullet holes and blackened by fire. German transport planes circled overhead like vultures, waiting for the signal to land reinforcements. But the Allies had dug in deep, turning every building, trench, and bush into a fortress. The paratrooper swallowed hard, his throat tight with fear. He knew what that meant. If they failed to secure the airfield, the entire operation could collapse. Without control of Maleme, the rest of the division would be stranded, and they would be left at the mercy of the Allied forces and the partisans who roamed the hills, merciless and unforgiving. The sergeant didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the airfield, his jaw clenched. Then he took a deep breath and turned to them, his eyes hard. "We're going to break through. We'll wait for the next artillery barrage, then make a push for that trench line. From there, we can try to outflank the machine guns and take out the mortar. It's our only chance." The paratrooper shifted his weight, his muscles tense. He could hear the distant rumble of artillery, growing louder and closer. He glanced at the airfield, seeing the dark shapes of enemy soldiers moving between the buildings. This was it. One more push. The paratrooper felt a cold knot of fear settle in his gut. The trench line was at least 50 meters away. Across open ground, they would be exposed to fire from all sides, but he knew the sergeant was right. They had to do something. Sitting here, waiting to be picked off one by one, wasn't an option. They reached the position, the sergeant plunging his bayonet into the last of the crew. The paratrooper stood there, his chest heaving, his hands shaking. The air was filled with the acrid stench of gunpowder and blood. He looked around, seeing the bodies scattered across the ground, the smoke rising from the wrecked mortar. The paratrooper surged to his feet, his legs pumping as he sprinted towards the trench line. The world was a blur of noise and chaos, the air thick with smoke and dust. He could hear the crack of rifles and the chatter of machine guns, the whistle of bullets whipping past his ears. He threw himself to the ground as a shell exploded nearby, the shockwave lifting him off his feet and slamming him back down.